Buonasera. Good afternoon. Sorry for keeping you waiting, especially Raju. Um, I apologize for the late start. I am not the moderator of the panel. The moderator is missing. Uh, not like, not like he fell off a cliff, like maybe he went to get gelato and lost track of time or fell asleep, or it's a beautiful day outside. I was actually going to suggest that we all go outside and do this in the palazzo instead, but this is a beautiful room for sure, and hopefully Chris Anderson, who is the moderator, will show up at some point. But with me I have Jay Rosen.
Hi.
Jay, what? Oh. And Julia Angwin is on via Skype. Hi, Julia.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good.
Are you in your living room?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I
No,
hope
that's
it's not too terrible doing this remotely.
no, not at all. You have a lot on your plate. Can I say what you're doing?
Yep.
Julia has left ProPublica. Some of you may know she worked there. She has left and is starting something new. Data journalism, data-driven investigative journalism. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to say any more about it, or does it have a
Sure,
cool
yeah.
name, or?
I need a name, so we can just spend this hour.
Yeah, if you can
crowdsourcing
think of
that.
any, that would be great.
But no, my colleague Jeff Larson, who I think is hopefully in the audience there, and I have been doing basically journalism, driven by technology, in the sense that we often build technological tools or use technological techniques to do our reporting on issues involving tech. And so we want to build a newsroom around that where we can scale that up. As many of you probably know at this conference, right, most newsrooms have a small desk of data journalists who are overtaxed and asked to do a lot of things for the newsroom. And what we're going to have is one programmer per one journalist. So it's a different approach, but one that I think the times demand, and I hope will be successful.
And I guess maybe I could ask you to address the question that is in the title of this panel. Is that possible, do you think, to, I guess, force transparency or somehow pressure platforms, or do we have to kind of reverse engineer the algorithms?
I think we have to do everything. So I think it's actually kind of a great opportunity. If you think about challenges journalists have faced in covering corporations in the past, this one might be slightly less challenging. Think about industrialization when Upton Sinclair had to sneak into factories to show working conditions inside. Or think about all of the coverage of banking crises over the past couple years, 10, 20 years. Journalists have really had to rely on the public statements of banks and banking regulators. And this industry technology is one where we have an opportunity to probe them technologically, not always and not as in many ways as we would like, but I think we should do as much of it as we possibly can. We should try to audit the algorithms. We should try to crowdsource people's experiences with technology. And it gives us more tools than we've had to hold private institutions accountable. And so that's why I want to sort of double down and add so many resources to that challenge.
So is it possible, do you think, to do that work and then come up with something and kind of wave it in the face of Facebook or Google or whoever and say, look, this is what we think the algorithm is doing, or this is what our data shows the algorithm is doing, and then force them to kind of cough up some actual info, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been having success doing that for the past couple of years. And, we, for instance, held Facebook accountable for the fact that they had this discriminatory ad buying
Right.
platform. And, the first time that we brought it to their attention that we bought a housing ad that just, we chose the audience. It said they have a drop-down menu where you can say exclude from my ad buy, and we would exclude African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics. And the first time we bought that ad and it got approved, which, theoretically seems like a violation of the Fair Housing Act, they said, oh, we're going to fix it. And then a year later, we bought the same ad and fixed it. And so then they finally got rid of the drop-down menu so that they've only gotten rid of the drop-down menu for race. So unfortunately, you could still drop down and exclude a zip code, which is obviously very much a proxy for race. But, so it depends on if you want to call that a win, right? It took a year and they did something, so we could call it a win or we could call it very slow progress.
So certainly a small win. I mean, it's hard to imagine all the different ways Facebook can, that drop down's one tiny, tiny proportion of this massive, surveillance driven data engine. It would literally take hundreds of reporters just to keep their feet to the fire on a few of those types of issues. I think that's part of the problem, is just this massive, multi-armed octopus of surveillance.
Yes, that's right. And that's why, I've been doing this with, a small team at ProPublica, and they've been, very supportive, and it's been wonderful. But I just feel like the challenge of these global companies that literally set the rules for every bit of political discourse that we're allowed to have, requires more. And so we're going to try to build this whole newsroom around that challenge.
Can I ask some questions, Julia?
No. Sure. Of course you can.
Matt.
Of course you can.
Julia, you said you are going to approach this with a one reporter, one programmer structure. How did you come up with that idea?
Well, that's how I've been running my investigations myself, both at the Wall Street Journal and here. And so the reason I do it that way is because I feel that essentially what happens with the data desk as a service desk is that by the time the reporter comes there to talk to the data journalist, they have already developed their hypothesis, right? They've talked to a couple of people, they have 3 anecdotes, maybe they have 6, maybe they have 10, right? And they're like, cool, find me the data to support this. Now, the truth is that almost always, in every case, the data doesn't exist, right? Facebook is not collecting data, for instance, about its discriminatory ads, right? And so what actually needs to happen is for the reporter and the data journalist together to develop a hypothesis and then think, what data do we need to collect to test this hypothesis, right? And so that journey should be from the beginning together. And what happens when it's not that way is that I have seen so many times this conflict where the journalist believes a hypothesis and the data journalist says, well, there's no existing data to support that. And neither one of those statements is conclusive, right? Existing data may be wrong or missing, and the anecdotes may or may not be representative. And so the idea of these two coming together and using sort of the contextual understanding that the journalist has gotten from speaking to human sources, and they have a tip, or often for me it's like a tip, or somebody's led me to think that something, and then developing a whole bunch of investigatory techniques to see, well, can we develop a data set to see whether that's true or not, right? And oftentimes I would just like to say these data sets are not going to be perfect. None of the Facebook data that I've been able to collect is of any appropriate sample size, right? It's 2 billion people. I mean, I'm never going to get to that level. But, after doing a big crowdsourcing project where we built a chatbot messenger and asked people about their experiences with hate speech, we were able to collect data. We brought Facebook 50 examples of hate speech that they had taken down, and we said, do these comply with the rules that you have on hate speech? And they admitted that their calls were wrong half the time, right? Now, maybe that's not representative. Maybe they have awesome quality control and other measures, but it certainly leads you to believe that they don't have great quality control.
But I think part of the problem you just pointed out was that even to get the data to kind of interrogate the algorithm or figure things out about the algorithm is hard because they won't give you enough data to even come up with a hypothesis.
And it's going to get only worse, right?
Right.
So post Cambridge Analytica, they're already shutting down various aspects of research. And I think what's going to happen is all these companies are going to say, we're going to give you even less access because of, quote, privacy, right? And so I do think that, like, these techniques, although I'm obviously really bullish on it, I also feel like, we're going to have a hard fight.
It's getting harder, I think.
We're going to have a hard fight.
One of the problems in reporting on a technology like Facebook is nobody sees the same Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to monitor CNN in the U.S., I pretty much know how to do that. I just have to have somebody watching CNN 24 hours a day.
And it's the same for everybody.
And it's the same for everybody. On Facebook, nobody sees the same Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
So to hold Facebook accountable through this kind of reporting, Julia, doesn't it sort of imply that you need a network of people helping you who all have different Facebooks and can report on what they're experiencing on their page?
Yeah, that's right. It does. And in fact, that's what we have done with building the Facebook political ad collector. So after the election, when there was so much, after the 2016 presidential election, when there was so much talk about what kind of happened with dark ads and whether Trump's team had been using them, and there was no way to know, right? It was all just rumor and speculation. And so Jeff, my colleague, who's I think in the audience, and we were like, let's make sure this doesn't happen again, because we should know. I mean, at the very base level, we should know what types of messages are being spread by politicians. That seems like something that's in the public interest. So we built this tool. And the way we tackled that challenge that you mentioned, Jay, is that we realized everyone sees different ads. So we built a browser extension that is basically a little piece of software that any user can add to their web browser. And whenever they're on Facebook, it looks at all the ads on their page and sends them to our database, and then we sort them to see which ones are political. Jeff actually had to build, machine learning to do that. So we're using algorithms, right, to audit the algorithms, which is also fun. But then we built like a public repository of these ads. Now, it's still, as you said, there's not going to be an appropriate sample size. We only have a few thousand users around the world, but we're hoping to try. And that is, I think you're right, Jay, that is the challenge of doing this type of reporting, particularly with Facebook.
And
okay,
I think
so, sorry, Matt, but I want to follow up on that. So if that's the approach that you want to take, are you in your new company going to try and recruit a network of people who also want to hold Facebook accountable and are using their Facebook experiences and collaborating with you? Or are you planning to sort of reboot that network each time you need it? Or is it project by project? Or what? Is there, in other words, is there a possibility of combining accountability journalism with activism so that you have a standing network of people to assist in your reporting? Or what's your thinking on that?
could you build like a community of people who were willing to do that?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we don't know yet. One challenge has been that I generally think that you should be really respectful of crowdsourcing efforts. So we, for instance, with the political ad collector, we collect no personal data. Like the way we encourage people to use it is we literally know nothing. We don't know anything about them. We strip out their IP address, their Facebook ID. So we can't tell you even where they are located. So for the purposes of building a panel, which is really what you're talking about, right? Building the kind of panel that a Pew Research or something would build. It's not appropriate to strip all that data out because you can't tell if your sample is appropriate. And so we struggle with this challenge all the time. And I don't know what we're going to do. I suspect we're going to try everything, and one or two things might work.
That's a good point. I mean, in order for your research or the reporting to be to sort of withstand scrutiny, particularly from the platform that you're trying to challenge, you don't want to give them any, opportunities to say, well, your sample was flawed, or, you kind of missed it in this way, because then that's an easy out for them. Even the size, I remember Mark Zuckerberg saying that, fake news wasn't a problem because it was a tiny proportion of the feed, less than 1%, I think he said. Of course, 1% of news feeds for 2 billion people is still a lot. But he was effectively saying maybe it exists, but it's not a big enough problem to worry about. So I'm assuming one of the hard parts, if you're trying to challenge Facebook or any platform, is going to be convincing them that whatever you said they were doing was big enough, or your data was solid enough that they should have to do something about it.
Yeah, although I have to say that in reality, it doesn't really matter if the Rohingya is like, for instance, that hate speech that's been used to trigger, genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter if that's only 1% of what's happening on
Right.
Facebook?
No, that's fair. Yeah.
Like, and I'm very concerned about sample size, because I think it's appropriate to be cognizant of it. But I also think journalists have never had appropriate sample size, and yet our stories matter and they are important.
True.
And so I guess I'm struggling to try to move more towards the direction of collecting data at scale, while also acknowledging that truly one terrible thing like that is
enough.
Incredibly important and must be reported.
You said, Julia, that you're going to try and build a newsroom around this approach. So far, you're two people, not quite a newsroom. So, what is the plan for gaining the resources necessary to build a newsroom around this approach?
Well, first of all, prayer. We're going to try, to do a nonprofit newsroom along the lines of ProPublica. I think ProPublica has luckily proven the model, and has made people more aware that you can sustain a newsroom around this. If you look at Marshall Project or The Trace, you do see a rise in nonprofit newsrooms that are sort of topic specific. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to pull that off, particularly now when there's so much interest right now, I think, in this topic. And I think actually global interest, right? These platforms are really global powerhouses, and they determine so much of what happens. Now, it's a little early for me to state that we're going to be a global nonprofit. We do hope to build like our networks of crowdsourcing globally and stuff like that. Whether we're going to have offices, like a Perugia bureau, I would love that.
You should definitely have one of those.
But yeah, so we're going to try. That's the reason I'm not there, is basically I'm massively fundraising right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me it's an inherently global project. Mm-hmm. It's an inherently networked project, because you need many participants, and it has a link to activism, because journalists aren't the only ones who want to hold these giant companies accountable. And so I can understand the attraction. I can understand why you quit ProPublica and went out on your own, because there's a huge need for this and there's a huge potential for it.
Do you feel like I feel like Jay and I are now just questioning you, but it's a fascinating project for all the reasons that Jay's described. And have you thought about, are you going to partner with other organizations? Are there sort of ways that you can build a sort of network of nonprofits or network of, people who are interested in the same thing? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we'll start, our partnerships will probably start with, big publications that can extend the reach of our articles. So that's how we'll start, probably. We have always partnered, Jeff and I, sort of on an ad hoc basis with like the network of academics who work in this space, which is growing. And so we'll continue to do that. And I'm hoping we can, maybe not so much formalize it, but build some conferences and events around these types of collaborations because we all could learn more from each other. We have these conversations in these rooms, and the academics are having them at their own conferences, and we don't always share techniques as much as we should. And then I think you're right that there will probably be more collaboration with other nonprofits. I would say this though, we're not going to be an activist organization. I mean, there will be activists who will appreciate our findings, but this is going to be a pretty straight, journalism outfit.
Does anybody have any questions? I don't know if we have a microphone or not, but
I think we do.
Do we?
Do we?
Or you could just. Oh, we do have a mic. Does anybody have a question? No? For Julia or Jay or myself? Okay. We can just continue. Jay, do you have any thoughts, not just on Julia's thing, but do you have any thoughts about how we can approach this problem?
Well, I think what journalists have different options for confronting a Goliath like Facebook. And Julia is an example of one of the best options, one of the most practical ones, which is really tough accountability reporting about the Goliath. Right? And she's excelled at that. There's others who try and do it as well. Those who try a different kind of journalism about Facebook, which is the access version, have sources within the company, have a bit of a more difficult time because Facebook doesn't basically tell you anything.
Right.
And I watch the work of those reporters, and they flail around because this is just not a company that's used to talking. And I think it's interesting that while Facebook prides itself on innovation and iteration, when it comes to public communication, it's like in the 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, BuzzFeed has had some success in getting leaks of things like, say,
right. So that's another kind. Another kind of reporting is when you develop sources within Facebook who aren't supposed to be talking. And I noticed, for example, that Wired is getting. It has sort of seems to have like a network of people that talk to it that don't get named, right? And so it can kind of get a sense of what the mood inside Facebook is like. Like, for example, they just published a piece about how Facebook people were reacting to Mark Zuckerberg's testimony.
Yeah.
And they were all relieved because he wasn't terrible, and because the United States senators and Congress people didn't know anything, and so they're all breathing this big sigh of relief. So that's sort of like the mood of Facebook journalism, right?
And there was that memo that came out where one of the senior executives was sort of talking about the potential evil aspects of Facebook and how they had to kind of accept those in order to grow. That stirred up a lot of,
and that's another technique is the former Facebook people, right, who know something about the company and now have kind of a more of a critical edge. So we've seen that kind of journalism as well. And then there's like working with Facebook, because Facebook has its Facebook Journalism Project, right? They're here at the festival.
How does that help?
Well, I'm just trying to like map out the different kinds of relationships that journalists can have with Facebook, right? And one of them is through this official outreach program of the Facebook Journalism Project, in which you are asked to, learn techniques for using Facebook better. That's why when you go down to the room, in the hotel, the main hotel, there's the Facebook room. You guys have seen that. And it says, ask me about Instagram and ask me about live video.
Right. But not ask me about excluding black people from my housing survey.
Right. It's like, don't ask me any accountability questions. Yeah, don't ask me any accountability
questions not to ask.
Yeah,
me.
Or it doesn't say ask me anything,
right?
Which would also be an invitation.
That would be bad,
to journalists, right? So you can do that. You can play ball the way they want to play ball, and that's accepting help from Facebook. That's we want to help you with subscriptions. It's training, So there's that wing, and then there's majestic indifference in this sense. If you know what you're doing, if you know what your publication strategy is, if you have a way of measuring whether you're meeting your goals, we talked about this in the keynote that you helped me do, then you can just use Facebook for whatever it's good for. Right. You can forget about it the rest of the time. And if being on Facebook and putting your content on Facebook is helping you reach your content goals and helping you advance in your strategy, then you don't have to worry about the inside of the algorithm, and you can just exploit it for whatever good it can do you, and leave it when you feel like leaving it. And that's the approach I recommend. That's the content approach I recommend, is majestic indifference to what Facebook is doing, because you know what you're doing and you just use it for what it can be good for. And then there's the other option is just exit completely, and try to live in the world without Facebook, which can work as long as you don't need new subscribers and new readers and new audiences, because that's how you're going to get them.
And I think implicit in the question that is the title of this panel is that there is a duty of some kind, or, the question raised is there a duty, do journalists have a duty to hold Facebook to account? Or not just Facebook, but platforms, algorithms, this type of, they are ruling our lives in a lot of ways. They achieve some potentially dangerous or socially bad things. Should we be holding them accountable in some way? Is that part of our job? Because it has social impact, because it affects people's lives.
It's totally part of a journalist's job. It's hard to do, as we were discussing with Julia. It's definitely a part of, like the way ProPublica defines its mission. ProPublica's mission is not just journalism. It's not even just investigative journalism. The way they've defined their purpose is accountability journalism, which means whenever there is a powerful agency, whether it's the Red Cross or the government or Facebook, which is a company, the Red Cross is a nonprofit, the government is a state institution, Facebook is a private company, all of them have to be held accountable to their public record and to the public good. So, of course, journalists have that responsibility, but they also, I'm sure, recognize that other agencies exist to hold them accountable as well. Right? That's the government's responsibility as well. Public responsibility. That's where activism comes in.
Julia, would you describe what you're doing? Does it want to hold people accountable, or is it mostly just to use data to report on anything, any type of story about anyone, not necessarily platforms or algorithms specifically?
I think we're definitely going to be accountability journalists, just much more tech infused maybe, but that's a nuance really. I wanted to piggyback a little bit off what Jay said about the types of reporting. For what it's worth, I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've tried all the different strategies, access, technological probing, et cetera. And I feel like the history of accountability shows us that some of the greatest accountability journalism has really come from not access journalism. If you think about the what was it, the FIFA scandal, or just some of the greatest stories of our time, Panama Papers, they're really not from people who sit around, just chit-chatting with their sources all the time. They really come from document diving and just gruesome Excel spreadsheet work, right? And I think that in a world where companies and institutions have learned to use complexity to mask their true moral decisions, that's what it takes to uncover what's really going on. And I'm not saying I won't go and chat with Facebook executives. I'll be happy to do that anytime, and I do. But they don't actually even know, right, what their systems are doing. Every time I've ever written a story about Facebook in particular, they say I didn't even know it was that. Right? So access doesn't get you anywhere when the machine is spurting out all these decisions.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just that you need spreadsheet journalism to get inside these complex companies. It's that one of the things access journalism does to you as a reporter is it gives you an investment in maintaining good relationships with the people who have to be your sources.
Which is theoretically antithetical to certain types of reporting.
Yeah, and that's a problem in all kinds of reporting, but it's especially been a problem, as Matt, you can talk about, in technology reporting, which seems to have a particular weakness for access journalism for reasons I don't quite understand.
Yeah, it does, and I maybe, Julia, you have thoughts on this as well, but it felt like, particularly in tech, lots of tech reporters are inclined to, they're interested in startups, they're interested in technology, they're interested in new things because they're exciting and interesting. And so Facebook at one point was just a startup. And then it got to be a really, really big startup. But it was still interesting, and Mark Zuckerberg is young and smart, and they're doing, interesting things, and it's a new sort of field in a way. And it seemed almost not harmless, but certainly not as harmful as it seems now. And so then you build up this atmosphere of, not that you're rooting for them, but that you there's a predisposition to see them as not harmful, as sort of either neutral or even beneficial. And, they're all really nice people. It's not like they're trying to rule the world explicitly. They just accidentally rule the world. And so then later you have to kind of change from one perspective to another. You have to suddenly say, well, wait a second, we were cheering in a way, or maybe we were positive because you were interesting, but now you're potentially evil, which is a big shift.
I mean, I've been a tech reporter since, I hate to say it, but since 1996.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I've been in this industry as long as there has been a tech journalism industry. And what my personal feeling is that it started out, it's one of these origin stories where the origin continues to build the culture, right? So in the beginning, the tech reporter in every newsroom was the one dude who knew how to use a computer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And usually that person was kind of a little bit of a tinkerer and a hobbyist also. And I say that with great respect for a lot of those dudes. A lot of them are my friends and, at papers around the country.
Yeah. I was one of those.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So you're one of those dudes. So, and I think that culture of the people themselves being kind of experimenters and hobbyists, it is what informed the early days of tech reporting.
Agreed.
And so it became, it was as a result, very gadgety and very review focused too in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then it kind of evolved to personnel moves, like, the Kara Swisher style of like, I know everyone who's going to be fired before they're fired. Know that they themselves know they're fired. And which was also fine. But somehow there didn't develop any sort of cadre of like what we would call normal beat reporting behavior. Like, in Washington, D.C., where I started as a reporter, you just had to go check the FEC filings and you had to write those stories. And there were no stories like that you ever learned to write regularly in tech reporting.
Yeah. And I feel like that's obviously the problem of individual journalists who are nerds and geeks and who tend to, see themselves in other nerds and geeks who are running companies, and there's a kind of, you're inclined to think positively about them because maybe you want to be one, or maybe you tried to be one, or maybe, but media organizations themselves have also fueled that in a way by asking for those types of stories and not sort of pushing for the more critical stuff until it was too late. Yes. Sorry. We got questions. Hey. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And then this gentleman, and I think there was one back there.
Hi, my name is Astrid. I'm from Germany. I'm the tech editor of a German business magazine. It's called Wirtschaftswoche. And I'm thinking maybe part of the problem is also the way how Americans treat this topic. Because, for example, Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg, she's always been these stars, and you like to write stories about stars. And I think in Europe, it's always been a little bit more critical, and we were always asking questions, where is this going to lead to? How is this influencing society? Whereas in the US, everyone is awesome until they're not anymore, right?
Well, and there's a certain amount of U.S. exceptionalism there too, right? The U.S. to some extent is proud because Mark Zuckerberg's American, and proud because these things were created there and now they're ruling the world. And so part of you, if you're American, thinks, yeah, go Mark Zuckerberg, I think that definitely affected it.
Yeah, and you make a very good point about stars. American journalism does tend to be personality focused.
Right.
You're right about Russia by writing about Yeltsin, that kind of approach. But I think in technology, it's developed so that there are stars like Zuckerberg, but there's also companies become stars, and then the journalism becomes this like star journalism about companies, because you have these companies that are soaring. Like Uber, and it becomes super interesting for a while because the company is a star and it gets the star treatment.
And it isn't until later that you get the Kara Swishers or somebody, it gets big enough to the point where journalists who are inherently cynical and love to destroy things and say mean stuff about people will be like, wait a second, you can't be that great. So something bad is happening, and then maybe you get the digging too late.
I don't think they're inherently cynical. That's a romantic image.
Maybe that's just me.
It's a romantic image of journalists. They're also inherently sentimental.
That's why they're cynical.
No.
Okay.
Okay, my name's Guy Berger. It seems to me that a lot of tech journalism and tech obviously originates with a libertarian ethos. And I do think that this shouldn't, in the current phase, lead to the kind of opposite dystopian kind of perspective, because around the world, Facebook plays a part in terms of accountability of being more respectful of human rights than many environments where users are. Sure. So in that sense, Facebook likes to say it's accountable to its users, but of course it's accountable to its shareholders in the first instance. Sure. And its shareholders want to see money based on a certain business model. But that does require a degree of accountability to its users. If Facebook were to be handing over data to governments who can actually then arrest people on the basis of that data, this would discredit the company. So it's part of that libertarian ethos, I think, that Facebook has grown so fast and has become popular in countries that are not democratic.
Right.
Yep.
And so coverage, I think, should be a bit more nuanced and not necessarily take only what's happening, the kind of sea change.
Totally agree.
That's the situation in the US today.
I totally agree. And we're not talking about a company, like I keep telling people, we're not talking about a company that's deliberately evil. They're all very, very nice people. Mark Zuckerberg is a wonderful person, and he created something pretty amazing that does, and there are people keep coming up to me all the time from different countries and saying, Facebook is amazing because I used it to do this, or because it allows me to connect with this community, or because it gives me a voice and I don't have one in my country. Those things are all positive. So it's in the achievement of those things, all swords cut in two directions. And so you can't just have something that big and that influential and that powerful that only achieves good things. It just doesn't happen. So,
but that's part of why I said Julia's project is inherently networked international, because it's not just that people see different things in Facebook in different places. It's that, as you point out, Guy, Facebook is actually a different animal in different
places,
social contexts. And in some places, it is freedom of information, right?
Yeah.
It may be the most democratic instrument that people have, and so even to describe Facebook, you need an international perspective.
Agreed. It's a different animal in each country because people use it differently. I mean, in Myanmar, it's the news, and some countries, 97% of people get their information from it, so it becomes the media in a way, and that has all kinds of implications.
Rasmus.
Thanks very much. Julia, I think we all really appreciate all the work you've done at ProPublica and look forward to the work you'll do in the future. I have a question maybe for you or any of the other panelists, which is, Leaving aside your own work in nonprofits, how do you think about the potential conflict of interest in how news media cover platform companies that they have very, very intimate and complex business relationships with? So they are highly reliant on them as a source of traffic. They often sell their own advertising through their ad exchanges. They often advertise their own subscriptions on the very platforms that they write about. And sometimes I saw just most recently, for example, an interesting situation where a New York Times article about the tech companies cited a trade association that New York Times is part of that combats technology companies as a source, right? So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how you think that journalism as a profession can deal with covering an area where we not only have all the issues that Jay described with access journalism or other forms of journalism, but also that essentially journalists are covering companies that are their own suppliers and customers in some ways.
Yeah, great question. Julia, do you want to?
I guess I would say that I think that's a problem, but maybe I'm a little more sanguine about it than others would be. One thing I think we focus on too much in journalism is avoiding conflicts of interest, and I think conflicts of interest are unavoidable. And so I think a better approach would be to be really transparent about those. So I would rather see in those articles about Facebook a disclosure about the company's relationship. And I also think that those disclosures serve as mitigating force, because when you know you have to make that disclosure, you might think twice about going into that relationship. And so one thing we're going to do in my startup is be radically transparent in that way. We are obviously going to have some conflict of interest rules. You can't take money from Facebook or whatever. But I think that we have this idea that you can all just be pure, when in fact what we should really be doing is disclosing our impurities.
Jay, any thoughts?
Well, this is something we're thinking about now. As you know, I'm working with The Correspondent and its launch in the U.S. And as I said in my keynote 2 days ago, we're trying to take the optimized for trust approach to building a news site. And so The Correspondent does not itself gather any data on its users, but to Julia's point, it's not completely pure because it uses plugins and other third-party technology that does gather data. So you can't say nobody gathers data if you come to the Correspondent site. So that's an example of what Julia is saying. Conflicts are unavoidable. But one of the big questions we're facing as we think about the American launch is we have to try and identify likely members of the Correspondent. Best way to do that is through data. We have to figure out how to, excuse the expression, target those. We have to get our message, hey, we're the Correspondent US, you should join us. We have to figure out how to get that plea to the right people.
I hear Facebook is good.
Yeah, and how are we going to do that without? How are we going to do that without involving ourselves in this surveillance system? That's a very hard question, and every choice that you make kind of has implications for you down the road. And you know, there aren't any simple answers to that, as banal as that sounds. So that's a lengthy way of saying good question.
I'm not quite as sanguine as Julia. I mean, I know you can't avoid conflicts. Someone said to me, there are no clean hands in this business. I mean, Facebook, newspapers run data trackers, sometimes hundreds of them. Nobody ever mentions that in stories about data tracking, not that I've seen anyway. It'd be nice to have a footnote to say, by the way, we're tracking you right now, and there's an eyeball scanner or built in or whatever. So certainly disclosure, I'm 100% for as much as possible. I think a lot of people are just their eyes are gonna glaze over because they don't understand it, or they don't care, or it's in fine print at the bottom. I think the particularly Facebook, but also Google, news entities of all kinds it's a symbiotic relationship to the point where, in some cases, if you remove the symbiote, the host will die. These things are integrated so closely into the way we distribute news, the way we monetize news, the way we analyze news, the data we get about our readers, that's not just a little conflict. Like, it's conflicted up the wazoo. And so I don't know how, saying it would be nice. You might have the disclaimer about all your conflicts would be longer than the article in some cases.
Yeah.
But I think it is something that news organizations in particular have to deal with. They can't just wave at it and, oh, that's just technical stuff, or it's not really relevant. It's a significant issue, a serious problem, I think.
I just thought of another way that we want to try to address this. This is something that I'm trying to recommend to the correspondent that they do. So I think there's a lot of uses of members in journalism that we don't even know about yet. And in addition to transparency, as Julia said, or just throwing up your hands and saying, what can we do? We have too many conflicts. In this case of data surveillance, having to make necessary compromise, one thing you could do is take members, let's say, of the correspondent US who either have a special interest in this or expertise, or they are very privacy concerned themselves, and constitute them as a kind of advisory group or review group for the correspondent, so that members have to look at the choices you are making, understand the trade-offs involved in those choices, and make a recommendation to the other members who haven't studied it whether this policy makes sense or not. So you could try to use the membership as a kind of a mini polity for the larger audience, and then you wouldn't just be flying blind or making guesses. And so this is one of the approaches that I've recommended for the correspondent US. Whether they will do it or not, I don't know, but that's a little bit different than just transparency on the one hand, or too many conflicts on the other.
I think if you do have a community-based approach, you can go to that community and say, here are some of the potential conflicts. Which ones are you okay with?
Right.
Or which ones
can you live with?
Right.
Yeah.
Which ones would you rather us avoid? Which ones can generate some value that's worth it to us as a community? It's harder, I guess, if you're a giant media entity that doesn't really think of itself as having a community. So then who do you ask? Or were there other questions? I thought I saw another hand at the back. Anyone? No? Julia, are there other places that you're looking, other than, say, ProPublica? Are there people who are doing things that are interesting in this area that you look to as examples or to learn from, or kind of setting the goals or the way that you want to go?
Right now, I feel like the most of it is that I'm looking for is in academia. There's a lot of interesting tests and experiments that people are doing to see how different algorithms in the platforms work. There was a study recently that somebody did where they bought ads using certain targeting parameters, and then they knew who would get them, and then they looked to see what did Facebook disclose about what was targeted, and it proved something that I've always been wondering, which was, do they really tell you when it says this ad was targeted to you because of your age or your hometown? Was there also an additional factor, right? And they found, yes, that there were other targeting factors that weren't being disclosed to you. So that's the kind of thing where I look at that academic paper and I think that's a great finding. I always suspected that. How could I take that and maybe make a crowdsourcing tool where people could share more, or we could build on that. So those are that's the way, not the only way I get story ideas, but often I get my ideas through academic insights like that.
There was a student of Anna Massera who was here, who runs a journalism program in Turin. He and a colleague started a small tool that was designed to get people to share their Facebook feeds, and then they built a tool that analyzed the feeds so they could compare them to each other, to your point about everybody sees a different Facebook, so that they could kind of, I mean, it was a tiny experiment, but to kind of get at what is different in different feeds, and then kind of back into why is it different, what is it about them or their profile? Is there something you can learn about kind of targeting not just ads, but what the algorithm's showing people every day in their feed.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I would just say, as long as we have a little bit of time here at the end, that one thing that I always worry about in these kind of conversations is that I end up making it seem like you have to be a computer scientist to hold the tech platforms accountable. And I do want to just sort of quickly say that, you know, a lot of the things, some of the things we do are really sophisticated, but some of them aren't. Like, you know, anyone can go try to buy discriminatory ads on Facebook.
Right.
And, I do it on a weekly basis, and it doesn't take any technical skill. And so I guess want to just drop that in there for people in the room who are not, you know, who are thinking like, well, geez, you know, I'm not going to have a programmer working with me. There's plenty you can still do.
I want to ask Julia one more question, and then maybe we can wrap this up. If you're practicing accountability journalism for a large platform like Facebook, that suggests a question, which is accountability to what?
Yeah.
And there are various answers to that. When you're uncovering, for example, that Facebook may be a kind of a partner in genocide in Asia, then their accountability there is just to conventional morality, like right and wrong. Right?
Society.
There's accountability to the law. That's another kind of accountability. And then there's also accountability to their own mission or own statements about what they are doing, like we're a force for good, or we connect the world, or even Mark Zuckerberg's language of community, right? So you can hold people accountable to what they themselves say they are doing. And you can also hold them accountable to what you think should be their code or should be their value system. So, Julia, when you talk about accountability journalism or think about it for Facebook, what accountability to what?
I mean, I would say all of the above. However, I've had great success so far simply holding Facebook accountable to its own promises, right? And that's the lowest possible bar, because as we all know, they don't promise much, right? I mean, the terms of service is an entire disclaimer of all promises. Yeah. But I find those stories to be the most compelling, because, you know, we got a leak of their hate speech rules. Then we checked, they're not even complying with the rules. The rules themselves are kind of loony, right? So you could definitely write a story, which we did, saying these are the looniest rules ever. But then the story saying, but they're not even following their own rules, right? And to me, that's really the question that we face with the tech platforms is, who's watching them, right? Yeah. They don't have any oversight. And so we have to try to hold them accountable and show that the mirage of self-governance is a mirage, right? And I guess I feel like that's the highest challenge right now, because that's what they're saying. Trust us. We're going to do it. You can trust us. And so that's why I sort of focus first line of offense is on that, because I don't even think they're holding that line.
Right. And like, as you said, that's the sort of the first step is, are they even obeying their own rules, let alone are they obeying sort of other people's rules or social rules or ethical rules? I think the hard part of particularly a giant like Facebook, you know, it's huge everywhere. You know, it's a massive, massive entity. In some countries, as I said, it is the media. It's hard to. Each country is going to have its own laws. It may even have its own sort of social mores or ethics, if you will. It's hard to. Who does Facebook have to obey? Does it, you know, is it okay if it just obeys kind of an American version of where the First Amendment is the most important thing? Does it have to obey, you know, or does it have to custom make itself in each country so that it obeys their rules? And then I think if you require, you could wind up at a point where the country with kind of the worst rules might actually wind up being more influential, because Facebook conforms to that first, and then everyone else suffers as a result. It's just a really hard. I don't think there's ever been an entity as large or influential in the ways that Facebook is. It's even hard sometimes to figure out how to hold it accountable or to what. Yeah.
But how would you then measure success? What would be, if you hold them accountable, what is the success? Is it that then in the end they get regulated, people delete Facebook, they change their privacy? What is success?
Yeah, great question. What does success look like? I don't have an answer. I mean, ideally, they change to meet a test of some kind, or they are regulated if they don't. But then regulated by whom? Like, is the UN going to regulate them? Because, if the US regulates them, then they'll do things that are okay in the US. Maybe those aren't okay somewhere else. Does the EU regulate them because it's a larger group of nations with different views? And then how do they agree on who? Yeah, yeah. And then that's a hard job, is what I'm saying. It's hard enough to get agreement in the EU on like what speed a washing machine should go at. Like, how are you going to regulate something, as giant and all-encompassing and vague? Like the services it provides are not easy to get your hands around. It's not a product that you can grapple with. It doesn't, when it malfunctions, bits don't come off a physical thing that you can show didn't operate properly.
One way to answer that question would be to ask yourself first, what would it take to have an informed public about a platform, a company as big and successful as Facebook? What do we need to have an informed public? And then success would be moving the ball towards that goal, right? So to have an informed public, you need enough information to make smart decisions. You need to know what's going on. You need mechanisms that can tell you when something has changed. You need a public debate that's an informed debate. You need a public sphere about the essential questions, right? All these things that are required to actually have an informed public, as opposed to just people in the dark who know this thing is powerful and don't know anything about it. So success could simply be progress towards a public sphere in which we can actually hold these companies accountable, even though we know we're never going to reach that state. We can get closer to it. So that would be one answer.
Any other questions? Julia, was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I guess I would just add on the question of success that I think that we're just in the phase where we're trying to diagnose the problems. So
right.
I think success will be looking like successfully diagnosing the issues that we have.
I like
Good point. Good point. Well, thanks very much for coming, and please thank Julia and Jay. You don't have to thank me. And thank you for coming.
All right, well done.
Luckily.